Has anyone ever told you that you were the problem, just to avoid blame?
When your own mother calls you an inconvenience, with a smile on her face, it doesn't feel like an insult anymore. It feels like confirmation, like something in your gut finally snaps into place and whispers, see. It was never you who imagined it. That kind of truth doesn't scream. It seeps in quiet, like smoke under a door, until everything you thought you'd locked away catches fire at once. I stood there in her kitchen, still painted that soulless beige she called eggshell serenity, watching her hands wrap around a mug of cocoa she insisted on making me, like she hadn't just, moments earlier, said the one thing I swore I'd never let cut me again. She said it casually, the way someone comments on the weather. I just find your visits inconvenient. Then she looked up at me with that signature Susan smile, tight, performative, and paper-thin, before turning to the stove as if we'd been chatting about pie crusts. I had told myself I was done with this house, this family, this silent competition where the rules always shifted and I was always 2 moves behind. But somehow, like some kind of ghost tethered to the hallway wallpaper and the smell of fake lemon cleaner, I found myself back here for Thanksgiving. She had called 2 weeks earlier, more like issued a summons than an invitation. "Emma's coming with Blake," she said, the excitement practically dripping off her voice. It would be polite if you showed up too. That was how she phrased it. Not, "we miss you," or "it would mean a lot." Just that it would be polite. Like I was a social obligation she couldn't avoid this year. Emma, of course, was the sunbeam that lit up Mom's entire damn universe. The miracle baby, born 6 years after me, blonde and pink and perfect. Everything I wasn't. Even as kids, it wasn't subtle. I remember one Christmas, Emma got the Barbie dream house, while I unwrapped a knockoff brand diary with a broken lock. Susan smiled and said, "Well, you always liked writing, didn't you?" Like that justified the $12 gap in affection. Emma couldn't do wrong. When she spilled juice on the carpet, it was just an accident. When I did it, I was clumsy, careless, or trying to ruin things again. I used to think maybe I was just sensitive. But you don't carry that kind of rot inside you into your 30s unless it was real. By the time I pulled into her driveway this time, I had prepped myself for war. I promised I'd keep it civil, make a quick appearance, then leave before dessert. But then the house hit me. That damned white porch swing, the humming fridge I could hear from the hallway, the photo of Emma in her college graduation robe still sitting front and center on the living room shelf, like my own diploma hadn't been quietly stuffed into a drawer somewhere. And Susan hadn't aged much. She had the same bleached bob, the same tooth-in eyebrows, the same smug energy that suggested she'd won a competition I didn't even know I was in. She didn't hug me. Just a quick, tight-lipped, "Well, look who decided to show up." Miracles happen. Then she walked back into the kitchen like I was the mailman dropping off junk she didn't ask for. Emma showed up 30 minutes later with her fiancé, Blake, a walking Kenneth doll with a Range Rover smile. Susan nearly broke a hip trying to hug her. She squealed, actually squealed, like a teenager at a boy band concert. I stood there with a half-hearted wave, invisible as usual. Dinner was fine. Tense, but fine. Blake talked about real estate like he invented it. Emma recounted her recent influencer trip to Tulum and showed off her tan lines. Mom asked them questions, laughed at all their stories, and barely looked in my direction. The only thing she asked me was if I was still working at that dental place, like I was doing temp work between real jobs. I smiled and nodded. What was I supposed to say? "Yes, Susan, I have a steady job with benefits, I pay my bills, and I don't have a million followers, but I also don't base my self-worth on how many strangers comment on my outfits." That wouldn't have landed well. Then came the cocoa. After dinner, while Blake and Emma scrolled through their phones on the couch, and I started collecting plates because someone had to act like an adult, Susan stopped me. "No, sit. I'll make you something warm. You always loved cocoa." It was a lie. I hadn't loved cocoa since the time she burned my tongue on purpose when I was 9 and then told me to stop being dramatic. But I sat anyway. Watching her move through the kitchen, I realized something. She wasn't just indifferent toward me. She enjoyed the power imbalance. It fed her. Every raised eyebrow, every backhanded compliment, every awkward silence, it was all part of a game she'd long since mastered. When she came back with the mug, it was too full, too dark, with that faint hint of cinnamon she always added. She placed it in front of me gently, like a peace offering wrapped in poison lace. And she said it, just loud enough for me to hear, but soft enough that Blake and Emma wouldn't. "I just find your visits inconvenient." With that same pleasant, practiced smile she probably used on the cashier at the grocery store. Then she turned and walked away. I looked at the cocoa, then at her retreating back, then at Emma, curled up in Mom's favorite chair like she owned the place. Maybe she did. Maybe she always had. And maybe I was just done pretending that didn't matter. So I picked up the mug, walked across the room, and handed it to Emma with the same calm, robotic smile my mother had perfected. "Here," I said, "you always get the good stuff anyway." She didn't hesitate. She took it like she was accepting a prize. Took one sip, then another. And I just sat down, waiting. There's a strange kind of silence that only happens when everything familiar suddenly turns foreign, a suffocating stillness that creeps in after the second sip. Just 2 sips, and nothing in the room feels safe anymore. Not even the sound of your own heartbeat in your ears, or the way the light from the chandelier reflects off the polished oak table where everything used to happen, from birthday cakes to arguments that ended with slammed doors and years of cold shoulders. Emma's lips had barely left the rim of that cocoa mug when her body stiffened just enough to be noticeable, like something inside her had hit a wrong note, a discordant jolt that made her blink twice before her fingers twitched, and she tried to laugh it off, as if choking on a memory or swallowing the wrong way, but there was no laughter in her eyes, only confusion laced with something more urgent, something that made Blake sit up straight and put his phone down for the first time that evening. At first, I thought she might say something dramatic like, "What the hell is in this?" Because that's the kind of comment Emma would make, halfway between sarcasm and superiority. Like everything she touched had to meet a certain standard or else it was defective by default. But no words came, just a dry coughing sound that dragged on too long and echoed too sharp off the walls. Her hand reached up to her throat, fingers splayed and twitching, her mouth open as she gasped once, then again, and for a brief moment, no more than 3 seconds, maybe less, no one moved. Because none of us were sure yet if it was real or just Emma being dramatic, until Susan's eyes landed on me across the room, and I swear I saw something in her face shift, not quite fear and not quite recognition, but a crack in the facade that lasted less than a blink before she was up on her feet, moving faster than I thought she could at her age. Blake rushed over too, panicked but useless, hovering like a man trying to fix a car with no tools, asking if she was okay, telling her to breathe, saying her name again and again like repetition would solve whatever was clawing at her from the inside. Emma bent forward, now coughing hard, her face red, then purple-tinged, her eyes wide and wet, and all I could think was how quiet it still was, how the clinking of the mug as it hit the table seemed louder than it should have been, like a gunshot in a library. Susan shouted something, maybe for help, maybe for Blake to call 911, but it barely registered in my ears, because I was still watching Emma and wondering, not panicking, not acting, just watching like it was a scene from a movie I'd seen before and forgotten about. That's the thing no one ever talks about when revenge isn't about fury but exhaustion. It doesn't feel like justice, it feels like stillness, like breathing in after holding it for 30 years and realizing the air tastes different now. I didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't fake concern or rush to her side with a glass of water. I just sat there, legs crossed, back straight, watching my sister unravel like a ribbon pulled too tight, and it wasn't joy I felt or triumph. It was relief, bitter and quiet and dangerous. Susan kept yelling. Blake was fumbling with his phone. Emma was slumped against the armrest making shallow, raspy sounds, and I just checked my watch. 12 minutes. That's how long the struggle lasted, from the first cough to the moment the paramedics wheeled her out of the house and into the cold November air, bundled in blankets, an oxygen mask strapped to her face while her eyes darted wildly like a trapped animal. 12 minutes of chaos and flashing lights, 12 minutes of Susan trying to keep control of a situation that was slipping through her manicured fingers, 12 minutes where not a single person asked what I had seen, what I had done, what I had known. Because no one, not even Susan, expected me to matter enough to be involved in anything serious. The mug sat untouched on the table where Emma had dropped it, and as the EMT closed the back of the ambulance, I finally got up, walked over, and looked inside. There was still cocoa clinging to the ceramic walls, thick and dark with cinnamon. Susan stood next to me, arms crossed, her expression strained into something between grief and suspicion, like a woman who'd just realized the rules of her game had changed, but she wasn't sure who was keeping score anymore. She didn't say a word, not then, and neither did I. We both stared at the mug like it had betrayed us somehow. Later, when the house was quiet again and Blake had gone to the hospital with Emma, Susan poured herself a glass of wine, sat down at the kitchen island, and spoke as if we were catching up on old news. "It must have been the milk," she said flatly, not looking at me, swirling the wine like it might give her a different answer. She always said her stomach was sensitive. Probably spoiled. I nodded. Not because I believed her, but because I wanted to hear what lie she'd tell next. She was good at lies, she'd raised us on them. That Emma was special. That I was difficult. That things were fine. That love had rules. That pain was weakness. I knew every one of her lies by heart, but this one, this lazy, fumbling excuse, felt beneath her. Almost disappointing. "Probably," I said quietly, then looked at her hands, those hands that had rocked Emma to sleep and slapped me across the face with the same calm efficiency. Funny how milk only turns sour for some people. She didn't answer. Just sipped her wine, eyes on the wall behind me. I wanted her to look at me. I wanted her to ask. But she didn't. And that told me everything. If anyone had looked closely, really looked, they might have noticed that this wasn't guilt or panic sitting in my silence. It was patience. The kind of patience that's born from decades of being second, being overlooked, being told in 100 small ways that you don't belong. It wasn't about the cocoa. It was about the principle. The unspoken question no one asked, but everyone felt pressing at their ribs. Had the wrong daughter finally decided she didn't care if she got caught? And if so, what took her so long? There is something unsettling, almost surreal, about walking through a house that should feel like home, but instead echoes with a sterile emptiness, a kind of emotional vacancy that lingers in the air like cheap perfume long after its wearer has left the room. And as I moved through those familiar hallways the morning after the incident, the silence felt less like peace and more like a warning, as if the house itself remembered what had happened and was waiting to see what would unfold next. The sunlight filtered through the blinds in slats of gold that fell across the floorboards I used to crawl on as a child, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to stop pretending that anything about this place felt safe. Susan hadn't said a word to me since the ambulance pulled away, hadn't asked how I was doing, hadn't even attempted to mask her icy detachment with the usual false warmth she reserved for company or church ladies or anyone whose opinion she couldn't control. She had simply gone to bed, quietly, like someone closing a chapter in a book they weren't invested in, and when I woke up to the smell of over-toasted bread and the distant hum of the television tuned to a low morning show, it occurred to me that maybe she really believed things would go back to normal, that this whole thing, Emma gasping for air, the chaos, the screaming, could be tidied up like the leftovers wrapped in plastic and stuffed into the fridge door. I found her at the kitchen counter, hair pinned up, wearing the same robe she'd had for years, the one with the faded floral print and the frayed sleeve where her watch always rubbed against the seam. She was drinking tea, not cocoa this time, and reading the newspaper like it was just another Thursday morning. When she finally noticed me standing there, she didn't flinch or startle or even pretend to care that I'd caught her in that quiet moment between lies. She simply lifted her chin, gave me a nod that barely qualified as acknowledgement, and said, in that perfectly neutral tone she'd mastered decades ago, "I suppose Emma will be home from the hospital by this evening." Blake said she's stable now. Something about a reaction to one of those trendy probiotics she's been taking. Her voice was calm, practiced, and too even, like someone rehearsing lines for a role they didn't quite believe in but were determined to play anyway. And for a split second I wondered if maybe she'd convinced herself of that lie, or if she was testing me, dangling a version of the truth to see if I'd bite. I didn't. I simply pulled out a chair and sat across from her, letting the silence stretch long enough to make her glance up from the page again. "I had cocoa once," I said, not looking at her, but at the pattern on the laminate countertop, the same countertop where I'd sat swinging my legs as a kid while she quizzed Emma on her spelling and told me to stop slouching. "When I was 9. You made it for me too." It burned my mouth so bad I couldn't taste anything for days. She didn't respond, didn't blink, didn't even shift in her seat. Just took another slow sip of tea and folded the paper closed with careful precision. "You told me it was my fault," I continued, letting my voice carry just enough edge to cut. "Said I rushed you, said I was being impatient, dramatic. That I needed to learn to be more careful." Susan leaned back slightly, finally meeting my gaze with eyes that looked glassy but not wet, distant but not surprised, and when she spoke, her voice was softer, but not gentler. "You were always quick to cry," she said, almost wistfully. "Even when nothing was wrong." That was the moment I realized something critical. She wasn't hiding anything because she didn't believe she had anything to hide. She had rewritten history so thoroughly in her own mind that any version of events that didn't fit her narrative was simply discarded, edited out like a typo in a draft she didn't plan to share. And as I looked at her sitting there, serene and untouched by guilt, it occurred to me that maybe this wasn't about Emma at all, not entirely. Maybe this had always been about control. Later that day, while she was out running some errand, probably a convenient excuse to leave the house in case the police decided to call, I wandered into the upstairs hallway and opened the door to what used to be my bedroom, only to find that it no longer resembled anything of the space I remembered. Gone were the posters, the childhood bookshelf, the faded comforter with unicorns on it. In their place was a minimalist meditation room with faux plants, white walls, and a Buddha statue that felt offensively out of place in a house where peace had never once been part of the architecture. My bed had been replaced with a woven floor mat, my desk with a Himalayan salt lamp. But Emma's room down the hall? That was untouched. Still a shrine of soft pinks and baby blues, old dance trophies still displayed on the shelf, framed photos of her graduation, her prom, her pageant crowns. Everything dusted and intact like a museum exhibit, a curated collection of everything Susan had ever considered worth remembering. I stood there for a long time, staring at a photo of Emma in a white dress holding a bouquet, smiling with all the ease of someone who had always known she was loved. And in that moment, something broke, not loudly, not with rage, but with a cold, final click, like a lock sliding into place. This wasn't about who got the bigger slice of cake or the better birthday gift. This was about erasure. I had been erased, quietly, slowly, methodically, until the only trace left of me was in the attic, shoved into some forgotten box next to broken ornaments and outdated tax records. That night, as the sun dipped behind the bare branches outside and the temperature dropped low enough to make the windows sweat, Susan made dinner as if nothing had happened. Some kind of overcooked chicken with canned green beans and instant mashed potatoes, the kind of meal that could pass for comfort food if you didn't know it came from a woman who'd never once comforted anyone without a camera watching. We sat at opposite ends of the table, the silence between us thick and knowing, and when she finally spoke, it was with the kind of pointed casualness that made my stomach turn. "You know," she said, "I never understood why you turned out so suspicious. Always assuming the worst. Always reading into things." I looked at her, fork paused midair, and said calmly, "Because I learned it from the best." She smiled then, but it wasn't warm. It was that same thin, deliberate smile she'd worn my whole life, the one that stretched but never reached her eyes, and I realized something else in that moment. She wasn't afraid. Not of the cocoa, not of me, not of whatever storm might be gathering on the edges of this little facade she'd spent decades building. Because in her mind, she was untouchable. And in her world, people like me didn't fight back. But I wasn't 9 anymore. And this time, I wasn't burning my tongue just to keep the peace. There are things that live in basements, not ghosts exactly, though I wouldn't rule them out entirely, but pieces of memory. Fragments of the past that cling to the dust in the corners and the smell of mildew rising from old cardboard boxes and forgotten furniture wrapped in yellowing sheets, and it was in that kind of silence, that particular kind of heavy, sticky stillness, that I found myself standing at the top of the basement stairs the following morning, staring down into the cool, dim dark, holding my breath not because I was afraid of what I might find, but because part of me already knew what waited below. It had been years since I'd stepped into that basement, a place that had always carried with it a strange sense of distance and caution, like the kind of room that remembered every slammed door and muffled argument and learned not to ask for light, and yet there I was. My hand curled around the familiar chipped banister, the floor beneath me creaking the same way it used to when I'd sneak down for a book or to escape the sound of Emma practicing piano, always Emma, always perfect, her notes, sharp and clear like they were meant to cut through anything soft. I descended one step, then another, the cold rising to meet me, wrapping around my ankles and creeping up my legs like a whisper too close to the ear. The light switch clicked on with a faint buzz, revealing what looked like the same disorganized mess it had always been, bins of old clothes no one would wear again, holiday decorations tangled in strands of brittle tinsel, rusted tools piled in the corner as though our father, who left when I was 10 and never looked back, might return someday to fix a broken railing or hang a shelf. But I wasn't there for the decorations or the tools. I was there for the truth, or whatever broken, rotting piece of it might still be hidden in this house, tucked away in a drawer or a box, waiting for someone to ask the questions no one ever had the courage or the permission to ask. I found the filing cabinet half buried behind a stack of old luggage and a collapsed drying rack, the beige metal scuffed and stained, one drawer slightly ajar as though it had tried to breathe once and had been caught. It wasn't locked, which surprised me, though maybe Susan had stopped expecting anyone to look for anything at all. I pulled the top drawer open slowly, thumbing through years of neatly labeled folders in her precise handwriting, tax documents, school reports, hospital bills, and then, tucked behind a stack of outdated insurance papers, a single blue folder with my name on it. Not Claire's medical, not school, not even miscellaneous, just my name, Claire, printed in block letters, underlined twice in black ink that had faded into a gray smudge over time. My hands didn't shake, not because I wasn't nervous, but because I'd stopped being afraid of Susan a long time ago, afraid of her voice, her judgments, her ability to make me question my own memory, my own reality. Inside the folder were a handful of papers, each one older than the next, yellowed at the corners, clipped together with rusted metal and stained with what looked like water damage or something else, something more human. I pulled them out and read the top page. It was a medical report, dated June of 1998, the summer I turned 9, the same summer of the Coco incident I had all but convinced myself I had imagined, or exaggerated, or twisted into something it wasn't. But the report was clear. Toxicology results confirmed the presence of trace amounts of something I didn't recognize, a word too long and clinical to absorb in one glance, but the notes attached to the file were far more chilling in their simplicity. Child-reported oral burning and nausea. Substance consistent with known household toxin. Referred to Child Protective Services for further investigation. And beneath that, in different handwriting, probably from a social worker, was a line that struck like a gut punch. Child expressed fear of primary caregiver. Repeated concerns about punitive treatment and being too much trouble. Family interview conducted. Case closed. Insufficient evidence. It wasn't just Coco. It had never just been Coco. It had been real and documented and known and buried. And Susan, she hadn't even tried to hide it, not really, because she didn't need to. The world had looked at her smile, her clean home, her polite tone, and decided there was no way she could be a danger to her own child. She had built an entire life on that assumption. I sat on the concrete floor, the cold bleeding into my bones, the papers spread across my lap like pieces of a puzzle I never wanted to solve. All those years I thought I was crazy, dramatic, ungrateful. Those weren't my own thoughts. They were her voice, stitched into my head one cutting comment at a time, so subtly that I hadn't even noticed until now that I had stopped trusting myself somewhere around age 10. When I heard the garage door rumble open upstairs, I knew she was back. I tucked the folder under my arm and made my way upstairs, slowly, not with the urgency of someone confronting a villain, but with the calm of a woman who had finally found the missing page in a story she'd been told she wasn't smart enough to read. Susan was in the kitchen when I entered, unloading groceries with her usual mechanical precision, placing each item in the pantry like a performance, like a woman who needed control over every square inch of her domain. She turned as I entered, wiping her hands on a towel, and offered a smile that was practiced, but thin, brittle even. "You've been busy," she said, more a statement than a question. I walked to the counter, placed the folder down gently, and opened it without speaking. She looked at it, then at me, and for the first time since I could remember, she didn't speak right away. Her fingers curled slightly around the edge of the counter, the only sign that she might not be as unshakable as she pretended. I waited. "You were always such a curious child," she said finally, softly, like someone offering an apology they didn't mean, or maybe meant too late. "Always digging. Always needing answers." "I just wanted the truth," I said, not angry, not accusing, just tired. "And now you have it," she replied, her smile returning with a kind of unsettling calm that made my skin crawl. "So, what are you going to do with it?" I didn't answer. Not because I didn't know, but because I wasn't ready to say it out loud. Not yet. The truth was no longer a weapon. It was a foundation. But I wasn't finished building. There is something deeply ironic, perhaps even cruel, about the way life circles back to the things we tried hardest to leave behind, about how the most familiar scents can carry the weight of decades, how the simple smell of cinnamon on a cold, brittle morning can summon entire lifetimes of memory, of pain, of betrayal so deeply embedded that it no longer even stings, just hums softly beneath the skin like an old injury that aches in the rain. It had been 3 days since Emma collapsed in that overdecorated living room with the magazine-perfect throw pillows and the rug she wasn't allowed to walk on as a child, and though the doctors at the hospital insisted it was an allergic reaction, an unfortunate mix of spoiled milk and a probiotic that didn't agree with her gut, something about the way Susan hadn't asked once what was in the mug, or how it got to Emma's hands, or why I hadn't drunk it myself, was louder than any of the questions no one seemed brave enough to ask. Emma had been discharged that morning, pale but upright, her voice a little hoarse, her tone noticeably softer, like a woman who'd just seen her own mortality rise up to meet her in a mirror she couldn't quite turn away from. Blake had driven her straight to their place across town, offering Susan a tight-lipped nod and avoiding my eyes entirely, like a man who didn't know which version of the truth he was supposed to believe and was too frightened to ask. Emma had only said 2 things to me when I stopped by her bedroom before she left. First, she said, "Thank you for being calm. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." And second, after a pause, after the long silence that had always filled the gaps between us, she said, "You looked like you knew what was happening before anyone else did." I didn't answer either comment, because sometimes silence is safer than the truth, and because I wasn't ready to give her what she wanted, whether that was reassurance or confession or forgiveness. She left with her overnight bag and her pride wrapped loosely around her shoulders like a coat that didn't quite fit anymore, and I stood in the foyer of my mother's house, surrounded by the scent of overcooked ham and lemon cleaner, knowing that the real conversation, the final reckoning, was still waiting in the kitchen, the room where everything important had always happened, whether we wanted it to or not. When I walked in, Susan was already there, back straight, posture flawless, wearing a new sweater that still had the tag tucked into the seam, as if preparing for an audience that had yet to arrive. She was pouring 2 cups of tea, the steam rising in delicate curls, and when she placed one in front of me without a word, I noticed the subtle way she avoided eye contact, the way her fingers curled slightly around the handle of her own mug, as if it were a lifeline. The tea smelled faintly of cinnamon. I didn't touch the cup. I didn't have to. For a long time, we sat in silence, not the comfortable kind shared by people who understand each other, but the taut, unnatural kind that builds between two adversaries waiting for the other to blink first. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, as always, but stripped of its usual theatricality, the performance threadbare now, the script outdated and unconvincing. "You've always had a flair for drama, Claire," she said, not unkindly, almost with affection, as if reminiscing about an old high school play I once starred in that she never came to see. "You and your imagination." I smiled, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity of her audacity had finally tipped the scale from anger into something closer to amusement. "I didn't imagine the hospital visit," I said, my voice even, almost curious. "I didn't imagine the medical report. I didn't imagine the folder with my name on it in the basement." She didn't flinch. She didn't even raise an eyebrow. "I did what I had to do," she said, and it was the first honest thing I'd heard from her in years, maybe ever. "You don't understand what it's like to look at a child and feel nothing but disappointment. Not because of what they've done, but because of what they are. You were difficult, Claire. From the beginning. Loud. Demanding. Needy. I tried, but I was tired. And then Emma came, and it was like the world finally made sense. She was easy. She smiled. She didn't ask why. It was strange, listening to her speak so plainly, like peeling back layers of wallpaper to find that the mold had always been underneath, just hidden by patterns and paint. And in that moment, I realized that she wasn't confessing because she felt guilt. She was explaining herself because she still believed there was a version of the story in which she was the protagonist, misunderstood, overburdened, maybe even noble. I leaned forward, my hands folded neatly on the table. "You poisoned me when I was 9, I said. You tried to do the same again last week. The difference is, this time, you didn't know who would end up holding the mug." She studied me carefully, like someone examining a puzzle with a missing piece, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. Not fear, not quite, but recognition. The reluctant understanding that I was no longer playing the role she had assigned me all those years ago. For a moment, I wondered if she would deny it, call me paranoid, tell me I was sick, like she used to when I cried too loud or asked too many questions. But instead, she took another sip of her tea, swallowed, and said, almost wistfully, "I thought you'd forgotten." "I didn't," I said. "I just waited." She nodded, as if that made sense, as if my patience somehow validated her actions, and then she reached for something under the table, her handbag, and pulled out a small photo album, the kind with plastic sleeves and fading corners. She opened it to a page near the end and pushed it across the table toward me. There was a picture of me, maybe age 11, standing at a birthday party with a smile that didn't reach my eyes and a bruise on my forearm half hidden by my sleeve. "I never told anyone," she said. "No one asked." We stared at the photo together for a long time, two women joined by blood and history and silence, until I pushed the album back and stood up. "You didn't want me," I said, not as a question, but as a final note in a song that had played too long. "I didn't know how to want you," she replied, and somehow that was worse. As I reached the doorway, she called after me, not loud, but firm, like a last breath. "Are you going to tell her?" I didn't turn around. "No," I said. "Emma already has a version of you she needs. I'm not going to take that from her." Outside, the air smelled like cold dirt and dried leaves, and the wind cut through my coat like glass. I didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, but because the pain had crystallized into something sharp and manageable, something that no longer controlled me. I reached into my bag, pulled out the folder, and tossed it into the fire pit in the yard. It caught quickly, the edges curling into ash, the smoke rising in thin tendrils that carried away every unspoken word, every unanswered question, every moment I had waited for her to say she loved me and meant it. And as I turned to leave, the scent of cinnamon clung to my clothes, sweet and bitter and unforgettable, just like her smile. Some stories don't need endings. They just need to stop pretending they never began.